Right now, 3 of the planet's most closely watched fault systems are behaving in ways scientists are struggling to downplay. A pair of earthquakes just devastated a country that was already in crisis. A quake off the coast of Japan, barely a month earlier, tested a completely different approach to the same hazard. And a study published this June says the ground underneath Southern California is under more strain than it's been in 1,000 years. None of these are connected in the way you might assume, but together they tell you almost everything you need to know about what actually determines whether an earthquake becomes a headline or becomes a catastrophe. Let's go region by region, because the details matter here more than the headlines do. Start with Venezuela, because what happened there on June 24th, 2026, is now the worst earthquake disaster the country has experienced since the year 1900, and calling it a single earthquake understates it. 2 major ruptures struck just 39 seconds apart in the Yaracuy region of northwestern Venezuela, near the town of Yumare, west of the state capital San Felipe. The first measured magnitude 7.2. 39 seconds later, before the ground had even settled, a second and larger rupture hit at magnitude 7.5. Seismologists describe this kind of pairing as an earthquake doublet, and some analyses modeling the combined rupture have suggested it behaved more like a single, extraordinarily complex event approaching magnitude 7.8. For anyone caught in it, the distinction barely mattered. It was experienced as one long, violent, unbroken period of shaking. 2 details explain why this became catastrophic rather than merely severe. The first is depth. The larger rupture sat only around 10 kilometers underground, dangerously shallow. When an earthquake happens deep beneath the surface, a lot of its energy gets absorbed by the rock in between before it ever reaches ground level. When it's this shallow, almost none of that cushioning exists, and the full force of the rupture slams directly into whatever is built above it. The second factor is what was actually built above it. Venezuela has spent years under severe economic strain. That strain shows up directly in construction. Maintenance has been deferred, and enforcement of building codes in the country's densest, lowest income neighborhoods has been minimal for years. Huge numbers of people were living in unreinforced brick and block structures that were never engineered to flex under seismic stress. When the ground lurched violently twice in under a minute, those buildings didn't bend. They came straight down. The coastal state of La Guaira sat almost directly above the rupture zone, and roughly 80% of its buildings collapsed. Entire streets were buried under debris. In Caracas, residents endured close to a full minute of continuous shaking, sending people pouring into the streets in panic while the airport sustained damage. Power failed across large areas and mobile networks went down, entirely cutting off both families trying to reach each other and rescue teams trying to coordinate a response. USGS's automated damage assessment system flagged this as a likely mass casualty event within minutes of the second rupture, estimating a high probability that the eventual death toll would run into the tens of thousands. As of the most recent confirmed reporting, more than 300 people have been confirmed dead, over 16,700 injured, and tens of thousands remain unaccounted for. Numbers officials expect to keep climbing as recovery crews reach areas still cut off. Satellite damage assessments have identified tens of thousands of structures destroyed or severely compromised, including hospitals and schools, with total losses estimated in the tens of billions of dollars, a devastating hit to an economy that was already fragile before. The ground moved. Venezuela had roughly 8 million people already relying on humanitarian assistance before this happened. Hospitals already stretched thin, and political isolation already limiting how quickly outside help could arrive. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake is catastrophic anywhere on Earth. In Venezuela, every pre-existing vulnerability multiplied it. Now compare that to what happened in Japan roughly 2 months earlier, because the contrast is the entire point of this story. On April 20th, 2026, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake struck off the Sanriku coast of northeastern Japan, along the same stretch of the Japan Trench responsible for the devastating 2011 Tohoku disaster. Shaking was felt from Hokkaido in the north down through central Japan, meaning tens of millions of people experienced this earthquake directly. Japanese authorities issued tsunami warnings for waves up to 3 meters along parts of the northeastern coast, and roughly 44,000 residents in Hokkaido alone were ordered to evacuate to higher ground. A wave of about 80 centimeters was recorded at a port in Iwate Prefecture within the hour. The warning was downgraded to an advisory and then lifted entirely as the threat passed. Here's the outcome that matters. Final confirmed damage, scattered power outages, a handful of minor injuries, no deaths, and no building collapses. Read that again. A magnitude 7.4 earthquake, tsunami warnings, evacuation orders covering tens of thousands of people, and a country of over 120 million feeling the shaking. And the toll was measured in single-digit injuries rather than casualties, This isn't a story about Japan getting lucky and Venezuela getting unlucky. The magnitudes involved, 7.4 and 7.5, are close enough that geologically these were comparable events. The difference is entirely about what was built and how in the decades before either earthquake struck. Japan operates under some of the strictest, most frequently updated seismic building codes on the planet. Codes that specifically require structures to flex and sway rather than resist and crack. The country has invested heavily in base isolation technology, essentially engineered shock absorbers built directly into building foundations, and its rail networks are wired to automatically slow and stop the instant seismic sensors detect unusual movement. Hospital systems are designed to keep functioning through major shaking, and earthquake response has been drilled into the population from elementary school onward until it becomes closer to instinct than instruction. Following the April quake, Japanese authorities issued what's called a megaquake advisory, a formal statement that the short-term probability of a significantly larger earthquake had temporarily risen above its normal background level, in this case, to roughly 10 times the usual weekly likelihood. That's not a prediction. It's a structured, calm instruction for residents across dozens of towns to confirm their evacuation routes and shelter locations as a matter of routine, not panic. The geological setting explains why Japan takes this so seriously. The country sits at the meeting point of 4 tectonic plates and experiences somewhere around 1,500 felt earthquakes every year, along with roughly a fifth of all magnitude 6+ earthquakes recorded anywhere on the planet. This isn't a nation that deals with earthquakes occasionally. It's a nation built, quite literally, on top of one of the most seismically active zones on Earth, and its infrastructure reflects that reality by design. 15 years after the magnitude 9.91 Tohoku earthquake killed nearly 20,000 people along this same coastline, a magnitude 7.4 event struck the same general region and killed nobody. That single fact says more about preparedness than almost any statistic in this story. Which brings us to California, and to a piece of research published this June that earthquake scientists are treating with real seriousness. A team led by geophysicist Liliane Burkhardt at the University of Bern, working with USGS scientists including Catherine Scherer, published findings in the Journal of Geophysical Research. Solid Earth, showing that the southern San Andreas Fault system, along with the neighboring San Jacinto Fault, has reached its highest accumulated stress level in roughly 1,000 years. Here's what that means in practice. Along a locked fault, tectonic plates are still trying to move past each other deep underground, but friction pins the upper section in place. Since the rock can't slip and release that motion as it happens, the strain instead builds up as stored elastic energy in the surrounding crust. For years, decades, sometimes centuries, until it finally exceeds what the rock can hold, at which point the fault suddenly gives and all that stored energy releases at once. The southern San Andreas last ruptured in a major way back in 1857, the Fort Tejon earthquake, estimated around magnitude 7.9. That's 169 straight years of the Pacific and North. American plates grinding past each other at roughly 5 centimeters annually, with no major release along this particular stretch. All of that accumulated motion has to be stored somewhere, and the researchers' model says it's been stored right up to, and in some segments past, the highest stress levels observed anywhere across 1,000 simulated years of fault history. The second and more unsettling finding involves a location called Cajon Pass, roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles, where the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems physically intersect. The research describes this junction as functioning like an earthquake gate. Under the right stress conditions, a rupture starting on one fault can jump through this junction and continue onto the other, turning what would have been a contained single-fault earthquake into a combined multi-fault event. According to the study, a joint rupture crossing Cajon Pass could produce an earthquake in the magnitude 7.4 to 7.8 range, simultaneously threatening the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley all at once, rather than a single corridor along one fault line. Right now, stress levels on both sides of that junction are running close enough to each other, and high enough overall, that researchers describe the gate as effectively unlocked. Scherer has pointed out that it's precisely because so much time has passed since either system last ruptured that the accumulated stress has grown this large. And when asked to put a timeline on when the next major event might actually strike, one of the study's collaborators put it bluntly. It could be today, next year, or decades from now, and on a geological timescale, that range barely matters. The stakes attached to that uncertainty are enormous. Greater Los Angeles is home to more than 13 million people, sitting on soil that varies dramatically in how it responds to shaking, with certain low-lying and reclaimed areas known to amplify seismic waves considerably. Thousands of older soft-story apartment buildings from the 1960s and 70s are recognized as especially vulnerable, and gas, water, and electrical infrastructure cross these fault traces throughout the region. A joint rupture of this scale would likely mean fires triggered by broken gas lines, water systems failing exactly when firefighters need them most, major freeways and rail corridors severed, and hospitals overwhelmed at the precise moment they're needed the most. Researchers involved in the study have been direct in their message to policymakers. Treat a joint rupture as a realistic planning scenario now, not as a remote worst-case theory to revisit later. So, is all of this connected? Venezuela, Japan, California, plus a magnitude 6.5 in the Philippines, tremors across Papua New Guinea, a 5.2 in Nicaragua, all within roughly the same stretch of weeks. It's a completely natural question to ask whether the planet has somehow become more seismically active right now. The honest answer is no, and the reasoning matters. Earth produces thousands of earthquakes daily, the overwhelming majority too small to notice without instruments. Magnitude 6 or higher happens somewhere on the planet roughly 120 to 140 times a year, close to once every 3 days on average. Seeing several significant earthquakes within the same short window is statistically ordinary, not a warning sign of some new global pattern. Venezuela sits along the boundary between the South American and Caribbean plates, a transform system running east to west. Japan sits at a completely different kind of boundary, a subduction zone where the Pacific plate dives beneath the plates around it. These systems are geologically independent and thousands of kilometers apart. Nothing about one caused or influenced the other. What ties Japan, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and California together isn't a sudden spike in activity. It's that all of them sit along or near the Pacific Ring of Fire, a roughly 40,000 kilometer arc of plate boundaries that accounts for around 90% of the world's earthquakes and roughly 3/4 of its active volcanoes. This region is essentially always active. Monitor it over any given week. And you'll almost always find multiple significant events happening somewhere along it, because that never really stops. What has genuinely changed over the past several decades isn't the geology, it's how many people now live directly in its path, in cities that may or may not be built to survive what that geology will eventually deliver. Global urban population has exploded over the past 70 years, and a striking share of that growth has landed in exactly these seismic zones: Tokyo, Manila, Jakarta, Los Angeles, Mexico City, Istanbul, Lima. The real question hanging over all of them isn't whether a major earthquake will eventually strike. It's what condition their buildings, infrastructure, and emergency systems will be in when it does. It's worth pausing on why a jump from magnitude 7 to magnitude 8 sounds small, but isn't. The scale used by USGS and most seismological agencies worldwide is logarithmic, not linear. Each full step up represents roughly 10 times more ground motion and around 31 times more energy released. That means a magnitude 7.5 doesn't release slightly more energy than a 6.5. It releases somewhere around 31 times more. A magnitude 8 releases roughly 1,000 times more energy than a magnitude 6. That's why scientists get noticeably more concerned once numbers climb past 7. And it's also why depth, fault type, local soil conditions, and what's actually built above the epicenter all matter just as much as the magnitude number itself. A 7.5 at 200 kilometers underground in a remote area and a 7.5 at 10 kilometers underground beneath a dense city are, functionally, two entirely different disasters wearing the same number. One development genuinely worth knowing about, because it doesn't depend on predicting earthquakes, which remains beyond current science, is earthquake early warning. When a fault ruptures, it sends out fast, low-energy waves ahead of the slower, destructive shaking waves behind them. Systems built to detect that first signal can issue an alert, giving populated areas anywhere from a few seconds to tens of seconds of warning before the dangerous shaking actually arrives. That sounds like nothing, but it's enough time to drop and take cover, for a surgeon to pause a procedure, for a train to begin emergency braking before a bridge, for elevators to stop and open their doors at the nearest floor. Japan has operated a nationwide system like this since 2007, and it performed exactly as designed during the April quake. Alerts went out within seconds, and the population responded the way it had practiced for years, which is a large part of why the toll stayed in single digits. California's version, Shake Alert, is now active, statewide, and pushes alerts through apps and integrated public systems, though work continues on tightening the gap between detection and alert, and expanding how deeply it's wired into transportation and building infrastructure. Venezuela had no comparable system in place on June 24th. There was no advance signal at all, just 60 seconds of shaking that arrived with zero warning for millions of people. Here's what's actually within your control, wherever you're watching this from. You likely can't retrofit your building overnight, but you can put together 72 hours of emergency supplies: water, food, first aid, flashlights, any needed medications. You can know exactly where your home's gas shutoff valve is. You can strap down a water heater and bolt heavy furniture to the wall. You can agree on a communication plan with family for when phone networks fail and know your neighborhood's evacuation routes in advance. None of this takes more than an afternoon to set up, and in a serious earthquake, that afternoon of preparation is genuinely the difference between getting through it and not. It's worth widening the lens briefly, because Venezuela and California aren't the only places carrying this kind of buried risk. Istanbul, home to more than 15 million people, sits roughly 20 kilometers from the North Anatolian Fault, one of the best studied strike-slip faults on Earth. Over the 20th century, that fault produced a sequence of major earthquakes marching steadily westward across Turkey, most recently the 1999 Izmit earthquake, which killed over 17,000 people. The next segment in that sequence, locked beneath the Sea of Marmara just south of the city, hasn't ruptured since 1766, and researchers put the odds of a magnitude 7.3 plus striking beneath Istanbul within the next 30 years at close to a coin flip. The pattern running through this whole story, ordinary geology meeting extraordinary human exposure, isn't limited to the 3 places making headlines this month. The planet has been doing this for over 4 billion years, and it will keep doing it long after all of us are gone. We can't stop earthquakes, and we still can't reliably predict exactly when the next major one will strike. What we can control, and what Japan has demonstrated is absolutely achievable, is how prepared we are when it does. Venezuela shows what happens when poverty, political instability, and deferred infrastructure investment meet a shallow 7.5. Japan shows what happens when a society treats that same geological reality seriously for generations and builds accordingly. California is the biggest open question left standing, sitting on fault systems now carrying more stress than they've held in 1,000 years, with a study this month making clear that the next major rupture there is not a distant hypothetical anymore. What happens when it finally arrives will come down to decisions being made right now by engineers, planners, and residents alike, and that story is still being written.